Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our first Wednesdays with faculty of the semester. I would like for us to just start again like we did on yesterday with just a collective breath as we take in all that is going on around the world, around our nation, in Minneapolis and other places. So we can just take a few seconds of breathing, grounding. We breathe for all who cannot breathe today. We breathe for all who are hurting to breathe. We breathe for all the vulnerable, all the marginalized, all those in power who hurt others, and those who are standing up. And showing up and speaking up. Thank you. I would like to thank Dr. Carr, as always, for starting this wonderful, wonderful gift, I think, to Union and to our students and to our staff. And I'll welcome you now so you can give us a little introduction to someone who does not need an introduction. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Thank you all for being here. Yeah, it's just such a nice aspect of being in an intellectual learning community together, to have these moments, to hear from colleagues and expand a conversation around different kinds of things that we're thinking about and working on. And as Sandra said, in many ways, because full-time teaching colleagues are the people presenting in this Faculty Wednesday series, they don't require an intro, and at the same time, I think it's just nice to take a moment to celebrate the amazing minds that we have the privilege to work alongside. And I certainly feel that about my colleague, Professor Andrea White, who is a major draw across the speaking circuit. The different kinds of places she speaks on and that sort of thing are all over the place. So here's a place where we get to enjoy Professor White's work. And one thing I've particularly appreciated about Andrea White's use of this time, she's presented here before, is she really takes advantage of this space to not just present fully polished and done work. That's fine, some folks do that, but to use this as space as a chance to try out some new ideas and different kinds of things that she's been working on. And that's what I understand she plans to do today. And so has timed out her presentation in the hopes that we can have some conversation afterward. Anyway, with no more ado, let me just welcome Professor Andrea White, who will be speaking on Black Lifeworlds, Black Time. Professor White.
Thank you, and I promised to use my big Baptist preacher voice to compete with the sound in here. If it drops and you have trouble hearing me, would you please let me know? Are there people on Zoom online? Yeah, okay, so just give me a thumbs up if the sound's okay, thumbs down if you start to lose me. I want to thank my colleagues and the chapel team for organizing the faculty lecture series. Thank you, Professor Carr, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. Dirty look to Joe, that's an inside joke. I'm going to turn James Chapel, just as Professor Carr said, into a theological laboratory and share a thought experiment, a work in progress, some musings about what Katie Cannon started and invite us, her readers, to appreciate her fortitude in contending with theology's failures with, as Tracy West calls it, scholarly and spiritual stamina. My musings will be a bit truncated. I'm going to jump a little bit all over the place because I'm conscious of a meeting that's scheduled to begin at 12:30. I don't think that's going to happen. Dean Pock, where are you? But I'll do my best. Okay, faculty, colleagues, if you need to leave, I won't be insulted. Well, Katie Cannon, as we all know well, is celebrated as a founding scholar of womanist theological ethics. There's much to be said about the insights that emerge from an ethic grounded on Black women's experience, how it renders the work of theology as more capacious than traditional accounts are equipped to deliver, how it grasps theology's immanent frame, how it perceives race and gender as thoroughly theological problems. In her hands, theology's preoccupations with revelation and salvation has its ground shifted beneath its feet. But rather than engage the revelation experience debate of old and its accompanying probes into theological method, however valuable, and my students know I do deem these valuable, and rather than address the more commonly rehearsed questions of redemptive suffering with race and gender oppression in view, instead I want to grapple with the theological possibilities of Black world-making that emerge from Cannon's intuitions about narrative discourse and its creative force. My grappling is inspired by a well-known tenet of Katie Cannon's work, but less often tapped for its particularly theological import. In the 1984 annual of the Society of Christian Ethics, Katie Cannon casts Black women's literary tradition as a source for engendering an ethic of life. Such casting calls into question the capacity of Christian ethics to bear up human experience when Black experience is either outside its angle of vision or distorted. Her linking of Black religion with Black literature altogether bypasses the limitations of traditional theological ethics. Black women's writing represents the moral wisdom and real lived texture of Black life in a way that simply cannot be conveyed inside the dominant assumptions of Christian ethics, most poignantly the assumption of freedom and its status as a taken for granted feature of human experience. Black women's writing becomes a decisive heuristic for Black life, integrating faith and ethics and illuminating Black religious heritage. Cannon contends quite forcefully, and I'm quoting her here, "There is no better source for comprehending the real lived texture of Black experience and the meaning of the moral life in the Black context than the Black women's literary tradition. Black women's literature offers the sharpest available view of the Black community's soul." This is a hefty claim. Cannon is granting hermeneutical privilege to Black women's writing to probe Black experience, to illuminate the soul of the Black community. Cannon states it clearly, "It is my thesis that the Black women's literary tradition is the best available literary repository for understanding the ethical values Black women have created and cultivated." There may be other resources or sources for understanding Black life, but Black women's literature is distinctive for being the worthiest among them. It is, in fact, on her view, unsurpassed. Cannon asserts, in the quest for appreciating Black women's experience, nothing surpasses the Black women's literary tradition. Why is that? Well, first of all, Black women's literary tradition shows how slavery and its consequences forced Black women into a position of cultural custodian. Cannon refers to the meaning-making function of Black women's writings. She writes, As recorders of the Black experience, Black women writers convey the community's consciousness of values that enables them to find meaning. The irresistible power in the Black women's literary tradition is its power to convey the values. Black women's literary tradition is a source to interpret and explain the patterns in Black life, quote, from which ethical values can be gleaned. The Black community has fashioned for itself distinctive ethical values. Moral wisdom is not in itself redemptive. It does not, as she says, rescue Black women from the bewildering pressure and perplexities of institutionalized social evils. But such wisdom is revelatory, unveiling the violence lurking beneath ethical codes that take freedom for granted. I'm curious to explore the theological impact of canon's hermeneutical principle that grants pride and place to the Black women's literary tradition, the extent to which canon intuited the theological implications opened up by asserting a literary source for Christian ethics can only be speculatively asserted, since her theological claims are often more implicit than explicit. My aim is not a speculative argument for authorial intention. My fascinations lead me to a thought experiment with a theologically constructive ambition, one that takes into account and is even derived from the themes that arise in canon's womanist ethics through Black women's writing and the function of narrative. When Black subjectivity is marked by social death in the world, Black women's literary tradition and its proclamations of Black humanity in the world of the text become a transgressive means by which to affirm Black aliveness, to overwrite the grand master narrative of Black death. By imagining the fictive possibilities of Black life, Black women's writing is creating a life world. Canon puts it rather pointedly. Black women have used their creativity to carve out living space. This means the writing act of Black women is caught up in meaning making for the Black community and radically alters the relationship between fiction and history, troubling the waters about where truth is said to be found, truth in quotes. And I can't help but think here of Emily Towns' expression of the true over and against the merely true. Canon declares, Black women writers are the symbolic conveyors and transformers of the values of the Black community. Black women's literary tradition is a source to interpret and explain, again, patterns in Black life from which ethical values can be gleaned. There's an idea of narrative functioning here, and it's not idiosyncratic to canon. Dolores Williams relies on, as we all know, the Hagar narrative. Hagar's unusual encounter with God and yet more unlikely naming of God is all at once a challenge to salvation history, classical atonement theories, and certain liberationist accounts of redemption. Williams perceives Black women's experience as isomorphic with Hagar's subjugation, alien status, and wilderness experience. Canon and Williams make a similar maneuver critical for womanist work. Theirs is a method of appropriation, finding oneself depicted in the world of the text. But there's an intuition here that moves beyond representation and the narrow view of mimesis as imitation. Canon placed a great deal of stock in the matter of representation. The literary tradition is a meaning-making practice because it represents Black life in a way that Christian ethics fails to do. In Black life, moral agency may run contrary to the ethical boundaries of mainline Protestantism. Black women's writing and narrative represents a reality that is otherwise unreadable. Quoting her, the work of Black women writers can be trusted as seriously mirroring Black reality. Their writings are chronicles of Black survival. In their plots, actions, and depictions of characters, Black women writers flesh out the positive attributes of Black folks who are hidden beneath the ordinariness of everyday life. This is a matter of imaging, and in theological terms, it's the question of the imago Dei. As a womanist theology addresses the question of the imago Dei, the problem of representation and the matter of embodiment are both immediately foregrounded. Within the terms given by history, black female flesh is blackened, which is to say represented as abject. Ironically, both a source of shame and pleasure, an instrument of seduction and production. Invoking the imago Dei does not help much if religious discourse remains wedded to theories of representation. Imaging God gets read as representing God. In other words, who best represents God? What criteria are entailed for humanity to be established? Questions of representation involve both correspondence and gaps between reference and signs. Measuring the adequacy of a representation is also contingent on the conceivability of that which is represented, in this case, the God concept. Stating it a bit more crudely, may we ever know how well or how at all a human person images God if the God concept exceeds what we may rightfully claim to know? These are classic questions, and as an aside, I am persuaded by apophatic anthropologies that preserve alterity for both the human and the divine. I've just outed myself to my systematic theology students, where I try to keep my cards close to my chest, but now you know, if you remember the readings, you now know which one I'm referring to. But anyway, a whole new question is at stake when it comes to the question of black women imaging or representing God. The matter of representation is called into question because of classic questions in recognition politics, misrecognition, misrepresentation, visibility, and visibility. And I want to turn now to Zakiya Iman Jackson's reading of Hortense Spiller's, where she argues there are black female figures or representations that appear, but they function at the register of myth rather than indexicality, and therefore reveal how representation performs, she writes, rather than functions mimetically, as the notion of representation suggests. The question is not, what is the proper representation of a black woman? We don't evaluate representation's supposed accuracy or inaccuracy, its ability to represent the real thing, whatever that is. Jackson problematizes calcified representations of black womanhood and instead performs representation in a speculative mode. Black female figures underscore the manner in which representation performs in worlds and in unmaking of worlds rather than indexes the world as such. It's the problem of representing a sublime function that exceeds any claim to knowledge, but that can only be approached obliquely in a gesture of representation. Jackson's insight is a gesture toward a critique of the, quote, performative labor representation does in worlding processes, or the crafting and obliteration of worlds. The grammar of representation takes as its enabling figure that which is not only unrepresented, but more precisely non-representable. The grammar and logic of representation, I love that. If only my children could respond to me as quickly. Thank you, that was very nice. Sorry, kids. One teenager, one post-adolescent, 21-year-old. I love them dearly. Okay, where was I? The grammar and logic of representation reproduce the black female figure as always and already trapped within immanence. The black female figure is burdened with what is foreclosed from representability. Worse than misrepresentation, the black female figure is illegible and non-representable. She's figured outside the grammar and logic of representation. So again, on this account, the imago Dei, conceived as a mode of imaging, does not include the black female figure, and this is what I have in mind when I speak of theology's failures. Well, what about narrative? And what was Katie Cannon's intuition here about Black women's writing? The basic hypothesis about narrative is that temporality, a feature of human experience, is marked, organized, and clarified by the act of storytelling. Telling a story means deploying an imaginary space for thought experiments in which moral judgment operates in a hypothetical mode. Negotiation and play with ethical decisions can happen through the imaginary space or ethical laboratory that comes through the act of narrating. Narrative, then, can help shape a reality. As one philosopher puts it, the plot that we invent helps us to shape our confused, formless, and in the last resort, mute temporal experience. If I had time, I would spend a little time with Toni Morrison's analysis of the opening lines of her first book, Beloved, and all that she does with the word quiet. But I have to save that for another time. Anyway, human experience is ceaselessly shaped by this interplay between an indirect reference to the past and the productive interpretation that happens in the stories we tell. So the imagination is the capacity to produce something new in spite of the initial difference between terms that resist assimilation. The function of narrative is not a totalizing activity. It does not imply a closed-ended system, a story with a beginning, middle, and end, and that's the end of it, but it actually demonstrates the distance, the gap between itself and lived experience, between living and recounting. And this, I think, is Katie Cannon's intuition. I want to add another question to the mix. See if I have time to add this question. I might need to skip this question. Yeah, I'm Dean Pak. Should I? Yeah, I'm watching the time here. Yeah, I'm going to skip. Okay. Not skipping too much. Save that for next time. Please invite me back. Okay. All right. We're missing a little bit of a segue here, but part of the problem is in reading and writing a what instead of a who. The tendency is to misread blackness as a what that imposes fixity, so that blackness as a vaguely biological what takes on an eerie resemblance to those anti-black discourses that first claimed black bodies were indeed a what, a distinct subhuman species marked by nature, with a capital N. What if identities are not things but moments in space and time? Neoliberal myths of historical progress require that identities in linear time are fixed because progress requires a notion of fixity. Michelle Wright contends that in Middle Passage epistemology, which conceives Africa as a fixed origin, blacks are not true subjects or agents because they always react to or against white racism. Whiteness is the actor, blackness a reactor. Western civilization is often a pageant of white heterosexual masculinity firmly in tune with progress. Other bodies are affected, but they are rarely agents. Wright suggests the physics of blackness is interested in epiphenomenal time, the now, which is neither an effect of the past nor a cause of the future, but corresponds to the indeterminate, fuzzy, hybrid reality consisting of many strands. We actually experience time as sometimes overlapping, sometimes disconnected. The moment under interpretation is multivalent with no one truth that dominates, and thus no one truth that orders the importance of the various participants in space-time. Middle Passage epistemology is a narrative used by millions to tell themselves how they know they are black because they can locate their ancestry within this history. The Afrocentric linear progress narratives also consolidate a false notion of normative blackness within the heterosexual male. And she calls to mind iconic figures of resistance in U.S. black history, and they are overwhelmingly male. Frederick Douglass, Du Bois, Malcolm X, MLK, Baldwin. Iconic female figures are celebrated for passive feminine means of resistance that almost seem to signify submission rather than subversion. Harriet Jacobs is famous for lying prone in an attic for 7 years. Harriet Tubman for traveling by night and hiding. Rosa Parks for sitting down. This is the vertical logic that dominates the Western narrative. How do we not lock Africa in this linear narrative where Africa is defined as one of our past selves, locked in its past in romantic arrest? How do we not locate Black subjectivity squarely in slavery and racism and lack of agency? How does Blackness not get stuck in backward glances and fantasies of return that are widespread in narratives of progress? How is Blackness construed as lack, nonetheless not a void? What is power that moves against the grain, provisional, slippery, suggestive, imperceptible? Blackness is an invention that signals a symbol system for the abject, and Black life is lived in the presence of an always imminent death. Negrophobia is a repository for fears about sexuality and death, the preconditional backdrop against which lies the paradigmatic Western trope of citizenship and the inviolable masculine body. So Blackness poses a problem for the story of the human because extravagant abjection is an affront to the human. Blackness is a vantage point and as such a resource for the political present, not because it reifies and valorizes the lived experience of oppression, but precisely because as a limit concept for the human, Blackness compels us to attend to imperceptible zones of personhood. To be clear, this heuristic function of Blackness is neither pedagogical nor theodical. It would be sacrilegious to perceive Black death as sacramental witness. Suffering conceived as an explanatory analytic is a technology itself of violence. But if Black being embodies an ontometaphysical exile, a homelessness, then Blackness itself is best positioned to pose a problem for man with a capital M, and thereby to confront anew the provisional, precarious, and unfinished question that is the human. How do we realize a previously unavailable genre of the human? What if Blackness is a heuristic for imagining the human otherwise? How can Blackness set the stage for hitherto foreclosed theories and practices of being human? If the human is not a fait accompli, then how may Blackness be conceived as such a heuristic? Well, to begin with, the elaboration of unavailable genres of the human necessitate a new theology of time. Black time is predicated on a rhythm of perpetual waiting. How might this temporality inform a concept of the human as always unfinished, without ontological coherence, without optimism and its accompanying myth of neoliberal progress, yet not without its own dimension of futurity? What Black feminist Tina Kant calls a politics of prefiguration involves living the future now as imperative rather than subjunctive, the future real conditional, that which will have had to happen. The grammar of Black feminist futurity performs prefiguratively a future that has not yet happened, but nevertheless must. I cannot help but imagine this grammar of futurity as a new eschatological form, one that's resonant with the transfiguring effects of narrative that runs as ubiquitous subtext in Katie Cannon's hermeneutical principle. Now, I would say it's as if Paul Ricoeur, who's famous for all he has to say about narrative and time, I would swear he was reading Katie Cannon when he said, "Fiction builds its own referent and therefore opens new ontological possibilities that were blocked by the already existing." Cannon was acutely aware of the capacity of fiction to open up to new insights into reality. It is fitting that Ricoeur would name this transfiguration for all its theological connotations. If Black women's writing and storytelling is ever mimesis, it's more than a descriptive imitation of what is, but a depth inquiry into Black life worlds, broadening the horizon of human life and action. This is precisely the moral wisdom Cannon had in mind when she claimed the authority of Black women's writing to represent the soul of Black life. This is why Cannon could state her hermeneutical principle with such force when she proclaimed Black women's writing as the unsurpassed source for comprehending the real lived texture of Black experience, offering the sharpest available view of Black community's soul. Cannon knew the world-making power of productive imagination and its transfiguring effects of narrative. A new being in language is a positive conquest of the world, filled with reverberation, the multiplication of sonority. Space is filled with the dynamics of sonorous life. Here we are not caught in the nothingness of the image and the anti-world. On the contrary, we are directed toward a new reality. As one thinker declares, the imagination saves the world. I think Katie Cannon knew this too, and if Black women's writing opens up new realities with a new eschatological future, then maybe, just maybe, Black women's writing will salvage the world in which we live. Thank you.
Wow, that was, wow. Thank you so much, Dr. White. Do we have a few minutes for questions? Okay, thank you. All right, so we have a few minutes for questions. Anyone?
Laura. The very last sentence. Yeah, and I'm sorry I spoke so fast. I would have preached that a little better if we didn't have a meeting. Okay, my last sentence. Katie, I'm referencing a thinker who says the imagination saves the world. And I said, I think Katie Cannon knew this too. If Black women's writing opens up new realities with a new eschatological future, then maybe, just maybe, Black women's writing will salvage the world in which we live. I'm very intentionally not using saving the world, but salvaging the world. This is one of a womanist insight about the failures of theology, which is in its soteriologies and doctrines of salvation, and an overstatement of liberation. Those of you who know the James Cone, the critique of James Cone by womanists on this point know exactly what I'm talking about. I would say more. Yeah, thanks, Laura. Yes. And I'm happy to repeat the questions if you don't have a mic.
Happy New Year, Dr. White.
Happy New Year,
nice
Heather.
Nice to see you. Did I miss your question? Did you say your question? What was the question you were going to ask? And then the second thing is, can you say a little bit about Quiet as It's Kept, what Toni Morrison was doing there? Can you just say a little bit?
Yeah. There's an essay Toni Morrison wrote called Unspeakable Things Unspoken, and that in a way sums up what she's referencing. She argues in this piece, maybe 2/3 of the way through this essay, it's a big fat essay. It's actually the Tanner Lectures? It's a lecture. Anyway, she argues that she sums up her entire book, The Bluest Eye, in the opening sentence. If anybody could Google the opening sentence, maybe you could quote it for us. But she is talking about what is unspeakable, and the word quiet shows up in this sentence. Yeah, so there's something that's almost a secret that Black women know that is, unspeakable things unspoken. Yeah, it's really powerful. I'm not doing it justice. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. White.
Hi.
Thank you so much for that.
Thanks.
I have a quick question. It's actually more of a stylistic question, but I was wondering when you started to talk about Harriet Jacobs, if your choice of words there with prone was intentional.
Oh, yeah. It was. I mean, this is, I mean this to conjure up an image of how we, the gendered view of Black heroes, how we unwittingly, unconsciously are gendering Black genius, Black heroes, yeah. And so I use those Black women examples because I think there's a subtext of submission
Yeah.
in the way we tell the story, right? I mean, you almost can't tell the story without telling the story of their body position, either prone or sitting. Rosa Parks, what did she do? She sat down, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was called back to those infamous words from Kwame Ture, which is roughly, I'm paraphrasing, but the only position for women in the Black freedom movement is prone.
Yeah.
And so I was really struck by your use of that there.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I don't know. I've lost my colleagues. Any other questions? What do you think, Professor Carr? Is that good? Okay. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much for the water. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just a small announcement before we all leave. Tomorrow, the chapel will be led by Robert Pemi and Alisa Marano. So, and chapel will be on weekend in bike ceremony. So please do come tomorrow. Thank you so much.